The limbic system is also known as the emotional brain, and it's made up of a few different brain regions. It contains the cingulate gyrus, which is a long strip towards the bottom of the brain in the medial or middle side, and it sits right above the corpus callosum, which is the main white matter tract that connects the two hemispheres of the brain, and it's shown in green here. We've already gone over where the hypothalamus and the thalamus are, but they are included within the limbic system as well. The hippocampus is in the medial temporal lobe, so near the bottom and middle of the brain, and it's a longer seahorse-shaped structure. This is involved in long-term memory primarily. The amygdala actually sits directly anterior or in front of the hippocampus, and this is our main brain region involved in emotional processing and response to frightening stimuli. Last, we have the orbitofrontal cortex, which sits at the very front and the bottom of the brain. The OFC is involved in a lot of social types of cognition. So together, these areas make up the limbic system, which is important for emotions, emotional memories, and other things like interfacing with our endocrine system, and also with reinforcing different types of behaviors. The basal ganglia, like the limbic system, is made up of several different brain regions. This is made up of the caudate and putamen, and together these two structures are called the striatum. The globus pallidus, some subthalamic nuclei, as well as the substantia nigra. The basal ganglia is involved in a lot of motor preparation, motor action, physical task switching, and the timing of these types of physical behaviors. Apart from that, it's also involved in reward-based learning and goal-oriented behaviors. Since the substantia nigra is included in the basal ganglia, we know that there are a lot of dopamine receptors within this system. And these dopamine signals we've come to know represent prediction error. With humans, we make predictions all the time. So say I predict that the coffee cup that I want to pick up will remain right in front of me. So I reach out to grab the coffee cup, but my arm goes, say, a little to the left of the coffee cup. These dopamine signals represent my error in my intention to pick up the cup and where my hand actually ended up, so a little to the left. The ultimate goal here, and with any prediction, is to reduce this error, so to reduce this prediction error. So this makes sense that the basal ganglia is involved with reward-based learning and goal-oriented behaviors, because when performing these behaviors relevant to a goal or a reward, we want there to be as little error as possible. Moving on to the cortex, there are four main lobes of the brain. There are the frontal lobe, shown in pink here, the parietal lobe, shown in purple, the occipital lobe, shown in green, and the temporal cortex, or the temporal lobe, shown in yellowish orange. Okay, there are two main sulci of the brain, and remember that a sulcus is just a valley or a sunken area between two parts of the brain. The central sulcus at the top of the brain separates the frontal and parietal lobes. The lateral sulcus runs across the brain and separates the temporal lobe from the frontal and part of the parietal lobe. There are definitely more sulci, but these are just the two big ones I want you to be aware of. Okay, diving into the frontal lobe, this is home to the primary motor cortex. The motor cortex sends motor commands down to move parts of your body, like your lips to talk, your legs to walk, and so on. The motor cortex is directly anterior or in front of the central sulcus and is shown in red here. Anterior to the primary motor cortex, we have the premotor cortex, and superior to that is the supplementary motor areas. Among other things, these are responsible for the initial preparatory motor thoughts and actions. The rest of the frontal lobe, which takes up some major real estate in the brain, is the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for planning, organizing, and making decisions. Some of these behaviors and its relation to attention we call executive function. When a person has a lesion or damage to the prefrontal cortex, we see distinct but characteristic deficits. People will have difficulties reaching or keeping goals. They will have a lack of motivation to either start a goal or stop a behavior once it's started. Planning is inhibited, and sometimes moods and personalities can be altered. In the supplemental section on Canvas, I show you an example of Phineas Gage, who sustained major damage to his frontal cortex and the effects of that for the remainder of his life. There are lots of specific parts of the prefrontal cortex, and they all have slightly different functional roles. You don't have to dive too deep into these, but just be aware of these areas such as dorsolateral, ventrolateral, medial prefrontal, and the orbital frontal cortex, and also parts of the anterior, the front part of the cingulate cortex. So just be aware of these terms and know that they're housed in the prefrontal cortex. Next, the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe, broadly speaking, takes in sensory information from both the body and the world, and it integrates that information together to make sense of it all. That's a little bit of an oversimplification, but let's dive into this a little bit more. The somatosensory cortex is the most anterior part of the parietal lobe. It sits just posterior of the motor cortex and the central sulcus. And this is dedicated to interpreting sense information from our bodies. It has a specific layout as well, that is, different parts of the somatosensory cortex respond to different parts of the brain, or different parts of the body, rather. So if I were to stimulate one part of your brain, you might feel a sensation in your left thumb, and in another area, it might tickle your foot or your leg. A similar layout is also found in the motor cortex as well. There are other areas in the parietal lobe that have different functions. In this diagram, we are looking at the medial side of the brain, the middle. In blue, we have the precuneus, and the precuneus is responsible for things like mental imagery and episodic memory retrieval, or recollecting specific long-term memories. Another is the angular gyrus. This is visible from a lateral or outside view of the brain. The angular gyrus sits at the outer backside of the parietal lobe, and it's involved in numerous things such as processing numerical information, aspects of spatial cognition, and also precise memory retrieval. The next lobe is the occipital lobe, and there's no doubt that this is the lobe when it comes to dealing with vision and visual processing. There are different areas that process different aspects of vision. I'm not going to go into depth about that here, but I put this here for you to review sometime later on. The last lobe of the brain is the temporal lobe. We see that here on the side of the brain in this orangish color again. The two main roles of the temporal lobe you need to be familiar with is audition, or hearing, and memory. The temporal lobe is where you have the primary auditory cortex. This sits at the top of the temporal lobe, shown here in blue. So just know that in the temporal lobe, this is where we have the primary auditory cortex, and it's involved with auditory processing or hearing. Also in the medial side of the temporal lobe, we have a few structures that are really important for our memory system. We have the hippocampus, and below those we have the entorhinal and the perirhinal cortex, as well as the parahippocampal gyrus. Together, these structures, the medial temporal lobe, are really important for consolidating new long-term memories, among a few other things. And of course, this is not the only thing that the temporal lobe is for. It does a lot of other things, but those are two important functions that I want you to be aware of. Okay, so this wraps up our brief intro of the cerebral cortex and its major divisions. This wasn't an exhaustive review, but we'll be touching on these regions later on in the semester, so it helps to be familiar with those as we can relate these to specific behaviors.